If you don't want to rot in a nursing home, pack your things and get out of my house. Daniel's words echoed through the walls like thunder. For a few seconds, time stopped. His voice, so much like his father's when he was angry, pierced my chest with the same force one uses to shatter a beloved glass. Only this time, the glass was me. I looked at him without answering. His eyes were no longer those of the boy who once ran toward me with open arms, but those of a man hardened by pride, ambition, and ingratitude. Behind him, his wife watched with crossed arms, wearing that frozen smile she always had when something pleased her. I stayed silent, not out of fear, not out of resignation, but because I understood that speaking would be useless. So I took a deep breath, forced a smile, and said calmly, "All right, son. If that's what you want, I'll go." He lowered his gaze, perhaps ashamed, perhaps relieved. I'll never know. 1 hour later, a black car stopped at the door, and when Daniel saw who stepped out to take me away, everything he thought he knew about his mother shattered like glass. Stay until the end, because what I discovered about what he did behind my back and what I became after leaving that house will leave you speechless. The morning light filtered through the kitchen window like it did every other Tuesday. I was making coffee, the same ritual I'd performed for 50 years in that house. The house I bought with my late husband's life insurance. The house where I raised Daniel alone after his father died when he was just 7. The house that smelled like cinnamon on Sundays and carried the echoes of birthday parties, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. But that morning, something felt different. The air was heavy, thick with unspoken words. Daniel walked into the kitchen with that look on his face, the one he wore when he'd already made a decision and wasn't interested in discussing it. His wife, Jessica, followed behind him, her heels clicking against the hardwood floor I'd polished just the day before. She didn't look at me. She never really did. To her, I was furniture, a relic from a time before she entered Daniel's life and upgraded everything about it, including, apparently, his sense of loyalty. "Mom, we need to talk." His voice was flat, businesslike, the same tone he used with his employees at the tech firm he managed. I set down my coffee mug, the one that said "World's Best Mom" that he'd given me 20 years ago. Now it felt like a cruel joke. I turned to face him, my hands still trembling slightly from age, or maybe from the cold dread settling into my bones. "Jessica and I have been talking," he continued, not meeting my eyes. "This house is too much for you. You're getting older. You can't keep up with the maintenance. The stairs are dangerous. You're alone here most of the time." Each word felt rehearsed, like he'd practiced this speech in front of a mirror, or worse, with her. I glanced at Jessica, who stood behind him with her arms crossed, that perpetual expression of mild disgust on her face. The same look she gave the homeless man we passed on the street last Christmas. "I managed just fine," I said quietly. My voice sounded small, even to me. Daniel shook his head, sighing like I was a difficult client who wouldn't see reason. "You're 72, Mom. You fell last month, remember? What if something serious happens? What if you can't get to the phone?" His concern felt manufactured, wrapped in logic but empty of love. I wanted to remind him that I fell because I was carrying his boxes up to the attic. The boxes he'd stored here 3 years ago and never came back for. "There are wonderful facilities now," Jessica interjected, her voice sweet as poison. "Communities for seniors. You'd have people your own age. Activities. Nurses on call 24/7. Isn't that better than being stuck here alone?" Stuck here alone. As if this house were a prison instead of the place where I'd poured every ounce of my love and savings. As if loneliness were something that could be cured by institutional walls and bingo nights with strangers. I looked at my son, really looked at him. When did he become this? When did the boy who cried when his goldfish died turn into a man who could stand in his mother's kitchen and talk about her like she was a problem to be solved? "I don't want to go to a facility," I said, my voice firmer now. "This is my home. Your father and I built this life here. You grew up here. Every corner of this house has a memory." Daniel's jaw tightened. I saw the flash of impatience in his eyes. "Mom, don't make this harder than it needs to be. Harder than it needs to be." as if my entire life, my autonomy, my dignity, were inconveniences in his carefully planned schedule. We've already looked at several places. There's one in Riverside that has an opening next month. It's clean, safe, and they have excellent reviews. I'm not going. The words came out stronger than I felt. For a moment, just a moment, I saw something flicker across his face. Guilt? Regret? But Jessica stepped forward, her hand on his shoulder, and whatever humanity might have surfaced disappeared. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, her voice dripping with false patience, "we're trying to do what's best for you. You're being unreasonable." Unreasonable. That word hung in the air like smoke. I'd spent my entire life being reasonable. Reasonable when my husband died and left me with a mortgage and a child to raise alone. Reasonable when I worked 2 jobs to put Daniel through college. Reasonable when he forgot my birthday 3 years in a row. Reasonable when Jessica convinced him to spend Thanksgiving with her family instead of with me. And now, standing in my own kitchen, I was being called unreasonable for wanting to stay in my own home. "Daniel," I said softly, reaching for his hand. He pulled away. That small gesture, that rejection, broke something inside me that I didn't know could still break. "If you don't want to rot alone in a nursing home," he said, his voice cold now, all pretense gone, "pack your things and get out of my house." My house. Those 2 words echoed in my skull like a death sentence. This wasn't his house. This was mine. I paid for it. I maintained it. I lived in it. But then I understood. This had never been about my safety or my well-being. This was about something else entirely. I saw it in the way Jessica's eyes gleamed. I saw it in the way Daniel avoided my gaze. They wanted the house. They'd been planning this. How long? Months? Years? Had every visit been reconnaissance? Had every concerned phone call been strategy? I stood there, a 72-year-old woman in her own kitchen, wearing the apron I'd worn 1,000 times before, and I realized I had become invisible. Not just to them, but maybe to everyone. When does that happen? When does a person go from being essential to being expendable? From being loved to being tolerated? From being a mother to being an inconvenience? "Fine," I said quietly. The word tasted like ash. "If that's what you want, I'll go." Daniel's shoulders relaxed. Jessica actually smiled. They'd won. Or so they thought. I walked past them, up the stairs I'd climbed thousands of times, to the bedroom I'd shared with my husband until cancer took him. The room where I'd cried myself to sleep more nights than I could count. The room where I'd prayed for strength to get through one more day, one more month, one more year. I pulled out the old suitcase from the closet, the same one I'd used on my honeymoon 45 years ago. It still had the tags from San Francisco, from a time when life felt full of possibility instead of foreclosure. I packed slowly, methodically. A few dresses, some photographs, my mother's jewelry, the letters my husband wrote me during our courtship, the essentials of a life that apparently no longer had a place in this house. Downstairs, I could hear them talking in hushed, excited tones, probably already measuring for new furniture, probably already planning their renovations, probably already erasing me from every corner of this place. I didn't cry. I was past crying. There's a point where grief becomes something else entirely. Acceptance, maybe, or just exhaustion. I carried my suitcase down the stairs, one careful step at a time. Daniel and Jessica were in the living room, standing by the window. They turned when they heard me. "I'll call you once you're settled," Daniel said, not quite looking at me. We both knew he wouldn't. This was goodbye, even if neither of us said the word. Jessica opened the door for me, ever the gracious hostess in my own home. I stepped outside into the cool morning air. The garden I'd tended for decades looked beautiful. The roses were blooming. The jasmine I'd planted when Daniel was born climbed the fence in fragrant white clusters. I'd watered every inch of this yard. I'd pulled every weed. I'd watched the seasons change from this porch for over 40 years. And now I was leaving with a single suitcase, like a guest who'd overstayed her welcome. I stood on the sidewalk, feeling the weight of my years settle into my bones. Where would I go? I had some savings, but not enough for much. A small apartment, maybe. Somewhere cheap, somewhere lonely, somewhere that wasn't home. I looked back at the house one last time. Daniel and Jessica were already inside, probably erasing my presence room by room. Then I heard it, the quiet hum of an engine. I turned and saw a black town car pulling up to the curb. The windows were tinted, elegant, the kind of car that didn't belong in this middle-class neighborhood. It stopped directly in front of me, and for a moment, I wondered if I'd somehow ordered a taxi in my daze. But I hadn't. The driver stepped out, an older gentleman in a crisp suit. "Mrs. Hayes?" he asked politely. I nodded, confused. He opened the back door. "I've been sent to pick you up." My heart raced. Sent by whom? But before I could ask, a voice came from inside the car. A voice I hadn't heard in 50 years but would have recognized anywhere. "Hello, Margaret." My breath caught. No, it couldn't be. I bent down and looked inside. There, sitting in the back seat with silver hair and eyes that still held the warmth I remembered from another lifetime, was Edward Langford, the man I'd loved before I'd ever met Daniel's father, the man I'd said goodbye to when life took us in different directions, the man I thought I'd never see again. "Edward?" My voice was barely a whisper. He smiled, that same gentle smile that used to make my heart skip. "I heard you might need a ride," he said, "and perhaps a place to stay." Behind me, I heard the front door open. Daniel stepped onto the porch. He saw the car. He saw me standing there. And then he saw Edward step out, tall and dignified, extending his hand to help me inside. My son's face went white. He recognized the name, even if he'd never met the man. I'd told him stories, years ago, about my first love, about the architect who'd moved to Monterey, about the life I'd almost lived. "Mom?" Daniel's voice cracked, but I didn't turn around. I took Edward's hand, stepped into the car, and closed the door behind me. As we pulled away, I finally looked back. Daniel stood frozen on the porch, his mouth open, his world clearly tilting on its axis. For the first time that morning, I smiled. Not out of spite, not out of triumph, but because for the first time in years, I felt like maybe, just maybe, I wasn't invisible after all. The drive to Monterey Bay took 3 hours, but it felt like traveling through time itself. Edward and I sat in comfortable silence for the first hour, the kind of silence that only exists between people who once knew each other deeply. The California coastline unfolded beside us, golden cliffs dropping into an endless blue ocean. I watched the landscape change from suburban sprawl to open highway to the wild, untamed beauty of the coast. It felt like shedding skin, leaving behind not just a house, but an entire version of myself I no longer recognized. "How did you know?" I finally asked, my voice barely audible over the hum of the engine. Edward turned to me, his profile still handsome despite the years etched into his face. "Your neighbor, Mrs. Chen. She's been worried about you for months. She has my email from years ago, from when I sent you that Christmas card. Do you remember?" I did remember. 10 years ago, a card had arrived with a Monterey postmark. Inside, a simple message. "Thinking of you, Margaret. I hope life has been kind. Edward." I'd kept it in my drawer, a secret I never shared with anyone. "She wrote to me last week," Edward continued. "She said Daniel and his wife were pressuring you, that she'd overheard arguments through the walls, that you looked thinner, sadder. She was afraid of what might happen. Mrs. Chen, my quiet neighbor who brought me soup when I had the flu, who watered my plants when I visited Daniel last year, who I'd shared tea with on countless afternoons but never burdened with my problems. She'd seen what my own son refused to see, that I was disappearing, slowly, in plain sight. I called this morning," Edward said. "I spoke to Daniel, told him I was an old family friend and that I'd heard his mother might need assistance. He was very forthcoming about his plans for you." The way Edward said it, I knew Daniel had been rude, dismissive, had probably talked about me like I was a burden, an obligation, a problem that needed solving. So I sent the car. I hoped I wasn't too late. Too late. I thought about those words. Too late for what? For rescuing me? Or for something else entirely? We arrived at Edward's estate just as the sun began its descent toward the Pacific. The house sat on a cliff overlooking the ocean, All glass and clean lines, the kind of architecture that doesn't compete with nature, but complements it. Modern but warm, minimalist but lived in. It was everything my house wasn't. Open, light-filled, breathtaking. You designed this, I said. Not as a question, but as recognition. Edward nodded. 15 years ago, after my wife passed, I wanted something that felt like freedom. He helped me out of the car, his hand steady under my elbow. The driver carried my single, pathetic suitcase to the front door. How strange, I thought, that my entire life could be reduced to one small bag while Edward's life sprawled across this magnificent space. Inside, the house was even more stunning. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the ocean like living paintings. The furniture was simple but elegant. Books lined the walls. Classical music played softly from speakers I couldn't see. It felt like stepping into a dream someone else was having. The guest room is upstairs, Edward said, leading me through the house. It has its own bathroom and a balcony overlooking the water. I hope you'll be comfortable. Comfortable. I almost laughed. I'd spent the last decade sleeping in a house where I felt like a ghost, and he was worried about my comfort. The guest room was larger than my old bedroom. The bed was made with white linens that looked impossibly soft. French doors opened onto a balcony where I could hear the waves crashing below. I set my suitcase down and stood there, overwhelmed by the kindness of it all. Why? I asked, turning to Edward. Why did you do this? We haven't seen each other in 50 years. You have your own life. Why would you— I couldn't finish the sentence. Why would you care? Why would you remember me? Why would you save me? Edward stepped closer, his eyes holding mine. Because, Margaret, some people leave marks on your life that never fade. You were one of those people for me. And when I heard you were in trouble, I didn't hesitate. That night, we had dinner on the terrace as the sun melted into the ocean. Edward had prepared a simple meal: grilled fish, roasted vegetables, a crisp white wine. We talked about the years between us, filling in 5 decades with stories that felt both foreign and familiar. He told me about his career, designing buildings across California, about his late wife, Anne, who died of cancer 5 years ago, about his daughter who lived in Seattle and visited twice a year. His life sounded full, purposeful, complete. Mine sounded like an apology. And you? He asked gently. What happened to the girl who wanted to paint? Who talked about opening a gallery someday? I took a sip of wine, letting the question settle. That girl. I'd forgotten she ever existed. Life happened, I said simply. Marriage, motherhood, bills, responsibilities. You know how it goes. You put away the things you love and tell yourself you'll come back to them later. But later never comes. Edward nodded slowly. It's not too late, he said. Those 4 words hung in the air like a promise I wasn't sure I could believe. The next morning, I woke to sunlight streaming through the French doors and the sound of seagulls crying overhead. For a moment, I forgot where I was. Then it all came rushing back. Daniel's words, the suitcase, the car, Edward. I got up and stepped onto the balcony. The ocean stretched endlessly before me, wild and free and utterly indifferent to human suffering. It was the most beautiful thing I'd seen in years. Below, I could see Edward on the beach, walking with his hands in his pockets, his silver hair catching the morning light. I found him an hour later in his study, a converted sunroom filled with drafting tables and architectural models. He was sketching something, his movements precise and practiced. Good morning, he said, looking up with a smile. Did you sleep well? Better than I had in months, I wanted to say. Instead, I nodded. Edward, I can't stay here forever. I need to figure out what comes next. I have some savings. I can find an apartment. Maybe get a part-time job. I don't want to impose. He set down his pencil and turned to face me fully. Margaret, you're not imposing. You're welcome here as long as you want to stay. But if you're determined to plan your next move, I have a proposition. A proposition. That sounded formal, businesslike. Not like Edward at all. I'm terrible with the financial side of my firm. Bookkeeping, accounts, client billing. It's the part of architecture I've always hated. Anne used to handle it, but since she died, I've been drowning in paperwork. Would you consider helping me? I'll pay you, of course, a fair wage. I stared at him, trying to understand if this was pity dressed up as employment. Edward, I don't know anything about architecture or business accounting. He smiled. But you managed a household budget for decades. You know more about organization and numbers than you think. And I'm a patient teacher. Think about it. You'd be helping me, and you'd earn your own income. Independence, Margaret. On your terms. Independence. The word felt foreign in my mouth, like a language I'd once spoken but had forgotten how to use. I started the next week. Edward set me up in a small office adjacent to his study, with a computer and files that needed organizing. At first, it was overwhelming. Numbers swam on the screen. Terms like accounts receivable and invoicing felt like a foreign language. But Edward was patient, explaining things twice, 3 times, never making me feel stupid. And slowly, very slowly, I began to understand. I began to see patterns. I began to feel competent, capable, useful. For the first time in years, I felt like I had value beyond just existing. Weeks turned into a month. I developed a routine. Mornings with coffee on the balcony, afternoons in the office, evenings walking the beach or reading in Edward's extensive library. He never pushed, never pried, never made me feel like I owed him anything beyond the work I was doing. But something was happening between us. Not romance, not exactly, but a kind of recognition of who we used to be, of who we might have become if life had gone differently, of who we were becoming now, together. One evening, as we sat watching the sunset, Edward said, "I found something in the attic. I want to show you." He disappeared inside and returned carrying a wooden box. He set it on the table between us and opened it. Inside were papers, yellowed with age, letters, my letters. Letters I'd written to him 50 years ago when we were young and foolish and in love. "You kept them," I whispered, tears stinging my eyes. "Every single one," he said softly. "Even after I married Anne. Even after you married Thomas. I couldn't throw them away." I picked one up, recognizing my younger handwriting. "Dear Edward," it began. "Today I painted the ocean at sunset and thought of you. I didn't remember writing it, but I remembered feeling it. That girl who painted. That girl who dreamed. That girl who believed art and love were enough to sustain a life. What happened to us?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "Life," Edward said simply. "My father's illness, your mother's expectations, the distance. We were young. We didn't know how to fight for it. Do you regret it?" I asked. Edward was quiet for a long time, staring out at the darkening ocean. "I regret not fighting harder, but I don't regret the life I lived. Anne was a good woman. We had a good marriage. And you had Daniel." At the mention of my son's name, I felt my chest tighten. I hadn't spoken to Daniel since the day I left. He hadn't called, hadn't texted, hadn't checked if I was alive or dead. It was as if I'd ceased to exist the moment I stepped out of his house. "Have you thought about reaching out to him?" Edward asked, reading my mind. I shook my head. What would I say? "Thank you for throwing me out? I hope you're enjoying the house?" The bitterness in my voice surprised me. Edward reached across and took my hand. His touch was warm, solid, real. "You don't have to decide anything right now. But anger, Margaret, even justified anger, it eats you alive from the inside out. I know. I carried it for years after my father died, after he made choices that destroyed our family's business. It took me decades to let it go. But I wasn't ready to let it go. Not yet. Instead, I threw myself into work. Edward's business was more complex than I'd realized. He had contracts across 3 states, projects in various stages of completion, clients who were demanding and difficult. But I discovered I was good at managing it, good at organizing chaos into order, good at anticipating problems before they became crises. Edward began relying on me more and more, and with that reliance came something I hadn't felt in years: pride, self-respect, a sense that I mattered to someone, not because I was their mother or their obligation, but because I was capable. One afternoon, about 6 weeks after I'd arrived, Edward came into my office with an unusual expression on his face. Margaret, I need to tell you something. His tone made my stomach drop. Was he sick? Was he asking me to leave? Had I done something wrong? I just got off the phone with a lawyer friend of mine. He continued. He does estate planning, handles property transfers. I mentioned your situation casually, and he said something interesting. He said that if you still have ownership documents for your house, you should check the property records, just to make sure everything is in order. I frowned. Why would it not be in order? Edward hesitated. He said sometimes when adult children live with their parents, especially if the parent is elderly, there can be irregularities, forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, financial abuse. It's more common than people think. My blood went cold. Are you suggesting— I couldn't finish the sentence. The thought was too monstrous. I'm not suggesting anything, Edward said gently. I'm just saying it might be worth checking, just to be sure. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed listening to the waves crash below, my mind racing. Forged signatures, unauthorized transfers, financial abuse. Those words repeated like a terrible mantra. Daniel wouldn't. He couldn't. He was my son. He'd made mistakes, yes. He'd been cold and ungrateful and cruel. But stealing from me? That was something else entirely. That was criminal. That was unforgivable. I got up and went to my laptop, something Edward had given me for work. I logged into the county property records website. My hands trembled as I typed in my old address. The page loaded slowly, each second an eternity. And then I saw it. The ownership record. The house I'd lived in for over 40 years. The house I'd bought with my husband's life insurance money. The house that was supposed to be mine until I died. It showed a transfer of ownership dated 3 months ago. 3 months before Daniel threw me out. The new owner, Daniel Hayes. And there, at the bottom of the digital document, was my signature. Except it wasn't my signature. It was close, eerily close, but I could see the differences. The way the M looped, the slant of the G. Someone had forged my name. My son had forged my name. I sat there in the darkness, staring at the screen, feeling something inside me break and reform into something harder, colder. The betrayal of being thrown out was one thing, but this was theft. This was premeditated. This meant that for months, maybe longer, Daniel had been planning to take everything from me, had been planning to erase me from my own life. And when he'd looked me in the eyes and told me to pack my things, he'd already stolen the only thing I had left. My home, my security, my future. I thought about calling him, confronting him, screaming at him. But what would that accomplish? He'd deny it. He'd have excuses. He'd make it my fault somehow. Or worse, he wouldn't even bother to deny it. He'd justify it. You weren't using it anyway. You were going to lose it to a nursing home eventually. This way it stays in the family. As if theft could be rationalized, as if love could excuse anything. No, I wouldn't call him. Not yet. I would do something else. Something he wouldn't expect. I would take control. Not of the house. I didn't want the house anymore. It was poisoned now, tainted by his betrayal. No, I would take control of myself, of my life, of my future. The next morning I told Edward what I'd found. He listened without interrupting, his jaw tightening as I spoke. When I finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "What do you want to do?" Not, "What should we do?" Not, "Let me fix this for you." But what do you want to do? It was the first time in decades anyone had asked me what I wanted. And I realized, with startling clarity, that I knew exactly what I wanted. I wanted justice. Not revenge. Justice. There's a difference. I want to see a lawyer, I said. I want to know my options. I want to understand what I can do legally. And then I paused, feeling something fierce and bright burning in my chest. Then I want to rebuild. I want to become someone he can't ignore, someone he can't dismiss, someone who doesn't need him or his house or his grudging approval. I want to become myself again, the woman I was before I lost her. Edward smiled, and in that smile, I saw respect, admiration, maybe even love, of a kind. Then that's what we'll do, he said. Together. The lawyer's office smelled like old leather and expensive coffee. His name was Richard Chen, Mrs. Chen's nephew, and he looked at me with a mixture of professional detachment and personal sympathy. I'd brought the property records, printed and highlighted. The evidence of my son's betrayal reduced to black ink on white paper. Richard studied them carefully, his expression growing darker with each page. "This is forgery," he said finally. "Clear, prosecutable forgery. You could press charges. Your son could face prison time." Prison. My son. Those two words didn't belong in the same sentence, yet here we were. "What are my other options?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Edward sat beside me, silent but present, his hand occasionally brushing mine for support. Richard leaned back in his chair. "You could sue for the return of the property, force a transfer back to your name. You could sue for damages, emotional distress. You could file a restraining order. Or," he paused, studying me carefully, "or you could do nothing legally and simply cut him out of your life. Sometimes the best revenge is living well, showing him you don't need what he stole because you've built something better." I thought about that. Prison seemed too harsh, despite everything. He was still my son, still the boy I'd raised, but doing nothing felt like surrender. "Is there a middle path?" I asked. Richard smiled slightly. "There's always a middle path. You could have me send him a letter, legal notice that you're aware of the forgery, that you have grounds to prosecute but are choosing not to, for now, that you're watching. It puts him on notice without destroying his life, and it gives you leverage if you need it later." Leverage. The word tasted bitter but necessary. We sent the letter that afternoon. I didn't read it before Richard mailed it. I didn't want to. I knew it would be formal, cold, threatening. Everything a mother's words to her son shouldn't be. But we were past that now. Past mother and son. We were two people on opposite sides of a betrayal so deep it had severed something fundamental. That night, I stood on the balcony watching the sunset and wondered if Daniel would call, if he'd apologize, if he'd try to explain. My phone stayed silent. Of course it did. 3 days later, Edward came to me with another proposition. His firm was expanding, taking on larger projects, and he needed someone to manage the entire financial operation. Not just bookkeeping, but budgets, payroll, contractor payments, client accounts. "I'm offering you a real position, Margaret, Director of Finance, with a real salary, benefits, everything. You've proven yourself these last 2 months. You're not just good at this, you're exceptional. I should have hired someone years ago, but I was too stubborn. Then you arrived, and everything fell into place." I stared at him, searching his face for pity. I found only sincerity. "I can't accept charity, Edward." He laughed, actually laughed. "Charity? Margaret, I'm being selfish. You've saved me hours of headaches. You've caught billing errors that would have cost me thousands. You've organized systems I didn't even know I needed. If anything, I'm underpaying you." He named a salary that made my breath catch. It was more than I'd ever earned in my life. More than enough to rent my own place, buy a car, rebuild a life from scratch. "Think about it," he said. "But don't think too long. I need you. I need you." When was the last time anyone said that to me and meant it? I accepted the position. Within a week, I had business cards that read, "Margaret Hayes, Director of Finance, Langford Architecture." I held one in my hand, feeling the weight of it, the reality of it. I was 72 years old, and I was starting a career. Not returning to one, starting fresh. It felt terrifying and exhilarating and impossible and absolutely right. I threw myself into the work with an intensity that surprised even me. I learned accounting software, studied construction contracts, attended client meetings. Edward treated me as an equal, asking my opinion, trusting my judgment. 4 months passed. The seasons changed. Summer faded into fall. I bought a new wardrobe, professional clothes that fit the woman I was becoming rather than the woman I'd been. I got a new haircut, let the gray grow out naturally instead of dyeing it brown like I'd done for decades. I looked in the mirror one morning and saw someone I barely recognized. Someone confident. someone purposeful, someone who existed beyond being someone's mother. It felt like resurrection. Then, on a Tuesday morning in October, my phone rang. Unknown number. I almost didn't answer, but something made me pick up. Mom? Daniel's voice. I hadn't heard it in 4 months, but I recognized it instantly. The same voice that once called for me in the night when he had nightmares. The same voice that told me he hated me when he was 16 and I'd grounded him. The same voice that told me to get out of his house. Hello, Daniel. My voice was neutral, carefully modulated. I'd practiced this moment in my head 1,000 times. I got a letter. From a lawyer. He sounded shaken, uncertain. Good. I know. I sent it. Silence. I could hear him breathing, could almost see him processing this. His mother, the woman he'd dismissed, had hired a lawyer, had evidence, had power. Mom, I can explain. Jessica and I, we thought, we were trying to protect the house, keep it in the family. You weren't well. We thought. He was scrambling, lying, trying to rewrite history. I cut him off. You forged my signature, Daniel. You stole my house. There's no explanation that makes that acceptable. More silence. Then, quietly, are you going to press charges? I let the question hang there. Let him feel the weight of his fear. I haven't decided yet, I said. Which was true. But that's not why you called, is it? What do you really want? I heard him swallow hard. I'm in trouble, Mom. The business. There were some bad investments. Some contracts fell through. Jessica and I, we're going to lose everything. The house, our savings, everything. I didn't know who else to call. Of course. He didn't call to apologize. He called because he needed something. Some patterns never change. I see, I said slowly. So when you had everything, I was disposable. But now that you have nothing, I'm supposed to be available? That's not fair, he protested weakly. Isn't it? I felt my temper rising but kept my voice calm. You threw me out, Daniel. You forged my name. You stole the only security I had. And now you want what? Money? Help? Absolution? He was crying. I could hear it in his voice. The sound of a grown man breaking down. Once, that sound would have destroyed me, would have made me forgive anything. But I'd changed. Pain had hardened me. Or maybe it had just clarified things. I'm sorry, Mom. I'm so sorry. I was wrong. Jessica was wrong. We were selfish and cruel and stupid. I know that now. I know I don't deserve your help. But I'm asking anyway. I'm begging. Begging. My son was begging me. The son who'd looked down on me, who'd called me a burden, who'd erased me from his life like I was nothing. Where are you living? I asked. Still in the house, he admitted. But the bank is foreclosing. We have 30 days. 30 days. The same house he'd stolen from me was being taken from him. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. I'm not going to give you money, I said finally. I heard his breath hitch, heard hope dying. But I'm not going to prosecute you either. The letter stands. You know what you did. You have to live with that. As for your financial problems, you're a grown man. You'll figure it out the same way I had to figure it out when you threw me out with a single suitcase. Mom, please. Goodbye, Daniel. I hung up before he could say anything else. My hand was shaking. My whole body was shaking. But I didn't cry. I'd cried enough over my son. I was done with tears. Edward found me on the balcony an hour later. I told him about the call. He listened without judgment, then asked, How do you feel? How did I feel? Guilty, relieved, angry, sad, empowered, broken, whole, everything at once and nothing at all. I feel like I made the right choice, I said finally, even though it hurts. Edward nodded. The right choices usually do hurt, at least at first. We stood there watching the waves, and I felt something shift inside me. Not forgiveness, exactly, but acceptance. Acceptance that my son was who he was, that I couldn't change him, that I could only control my own response. 3 weeks later, Mrs. Chen called. She'd heard through the neighborhood that Daniel and Jessica had moved out. A moving truck had come in the middle of the night. No one knew where they'd gone. The house was empty now, waiting for the bank to take possession. I thought you should know, she said gently. I thanked her and hung up. I thought about my old house, standing empty. All those rooms filled with memories now hollow and abandoned. Part of me wanted to feel vindicated, but mostly I just felt sad. Sad for the life that could have been. Sad for the relationship that should have existed. Sad for all of us. That evening, Edward made dinner, his specialty. Pasta with homemade sauce, fresh bread, a bottle of red wine. We ate on the terrace as the sun set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink and purple. I have something to tell you, Edward said after we'd finished eating. His tone was serious, and my heart sank. What is it? He took my hand across the table. I'm sick, Margaret. Cancer. The same kind that took Anne. I've known for a few months. I didn't tell you because I didn't want to burden you when you were rebuilding your life. The world tilted. Not Edward. Not now. Not when I'd just found him again. How long? I whispered. He squeezed my hand. The doctors say 6 months, maybe a year if I'm lucky. I'm not doing treatment. I watched what it did to Anne, and I don't want that. I want to spend whatever time I have left living, not dying in a hospital. Tears streamed down my face. Why didn't you tell me sooner? Because, he said gently, you needed time to become strong again. And now you are. Strong enough to hear this. Strong enough to handle what comes next. What comes next? I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know. Edward pulled an envelope from his pocket and handed it to me. My will. My lawyer drew it up last month. I'm leaving everything to you, Margaret. The house, the business, my savings, everything. My daughter has her own life, her own money. She doesn't need this. But you deserve it. You deserve security. You deserve to never be dependent on anyone again. You deserve to be free. I opened my mouth to protest, but he held up his hand. It's already done. And it's not charity. It's justice. The next 6 months were the hardest and most beautiful of my life. Edward's decline was gradual at first, then rapid. I took care of him the way he'd taken care of me. We spent his good days on the beach, talking about everything and nothing. We spent his bad days in the house, with me reading to him, playing his favorite music, just being present. He'd given me back my life, and I gave him the gift of not dying alone. When he passed on a quiet morning in April, with the sound of waves outside and my hand holding his, I felt something break and heal simultaneously. The funeral was small. His daughter flew in from Seattle. A few colleagues from the architecture world. Mrs. Chen, who'd made the trip to pay her respects to the man who'd saved her friend. And me, standing beside his grave, saying goodbye to the man who'd shown me that endings could also be beginnings. That loss could coexist with love. That it was never too late to become who you were meant to be. His daughter hugged me after the service. He talked about you constantly, she said. He said finding you again was the best thing that happened in his final years. Thank you for making him happy. I moved through the following weeks in a haze. Edward's lawyer handled the estate transfer. The house was mine. The business was mine. More money than I'd ever imagined was mine. I was a 73-year-old woman who'd gone from being thrown out with a suitcase to inheriting an empire. The irony wasn't lost on me, but it didn't feel like victory. It felt like responsibility. What would I do with all this? Edward had built something meaningful. I couldn't let it die with him. I hired a young architect to run the design side while I managed the business. The firm continued, thrived even, carrying Edward's legacy forward. 1 year after I'd left Daniel's house, I received another call. Daniel again. Mom, I heard about Edward. I'm sorry for your loss. His voice was different now. Older, humbler, broken by whatever the last year had done to him. Thank you, I said carefully. Where are you? He told me. A small apartment in Riverside, working as a regional manager for a retail chain. Jessica had left him, taken half of nothing and moved back to her parents. He was alone, starting over. Learning, he said, what it meant to lose everything. I've been thinking about what you said, about living with what I did. You were right. I was selfish. I was cruel. I treated you like you were disposable when you were the only person who ever really loved me unconditionally. Why are you calling, Daniel? I asked, not unkindly. A long pause. Then, I don't expect forgiveness. I don't expect anything. But I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly sorry. Not because I lost everything and you gained everything, but because I finally understand what I took from you, and I can never give it back. I closed my eyes, feeling tears I thought I'd used up. No, I said softly. You can't give it back, but I can choose what I do with that. I can choose to let it destroy me, or I can choose to let it free me. I choose freedom, Daniel. I choose peace. Can I see you sometime? He asked hesitantly. I thought about that. Thought about the house on the cliff, the business I was running, the life I'd built from ashes. Thought about Edward's words about anger eating you alive. Thought about the woman I used to be and the woman I'd become. Yes, I said finally. Not today, not tomorrow, but someday, when we're both ready, when we can sit together without all this pain between us. Thank you, Mom. His voice broke on the last word. Thank you for not giving up on me, even when I gave up on you. I hung up and stood on the balcony, the same balcony where I'd spent so many mornings watching the sun rise over the Pacific. The same balcony where Edward had told me it wasn't too late, where he'd shown me that life could break you and still give you back your soul. I thought about Daniel, about forgiveness, about redemption. I wasn't there yet. Maybe I never would be fully, but I was willing to try. Not for him, for me. Because carrying hate was exhausting, and I'd wasted too many years being exhausted. The sun was setting, turning the ocean into liquid gold. I thought about the woman who'd stepped out of a house with a single suitcase, broken and lost and invisible. I thought about the woman I was now, strong, independent, seen. The journey between those two versions of myself had been painful, devastating, transformative, but I'd made it. I'd survived. More than survived. I'd become. And that, I realized, was the real inheritance. Not the house or the money or the business, but the absolute, unshakable certainty that I was enough, that I'd always been enough, that no one could ever make me invisible again. I raised my glass of wine to the sunset, to Edward's memory, to the life I'd lost, and the life I'd found. Thank you, I whispered to the wind, to the ocean, to whatever force in the universe had sent a black car to rescue me when I needed it most. Thank you for the second chance. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to come home to yourself. The waves crashed below, eternal and indifferent and beautiful. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I felt at peace. Not because everything was resolved, but because I'd finally learned that peace doesn't come from other people. It comes from knowing, deep in your bones, that you can survive anything, even your own son, even yourself. The phone rang again. I looked at it, then silenced it. Whoever it was could wait. Right now, in this moment, standing on this balcony with the sunset painting the sky and the sound of the ocean filling the air, I belonged only to myself, and that was enough. That was everything. I smiled, took another sip of wine, and watched as the day surrendered to night. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new decisions, new moments of doubt and strength. But tonight, I was simply Margaret Hayes, not someone's mother, not someone's burden, not someone's employee or obligation or disappointment. Just Margaret, whole, free, finally, blessedly, completely myself. And in that moment, I understood what Edward had been trying to tell me all along, that the greatest inheritance isn't what someone leaves you. It's what you become in the process of losing everything and finding yourself. That was his final gift to me. Not the house, not the money, but the mirror he held up so I could finally see who I really was. And who I'd always been, underneath all the years of invisibility. Someone worth saving, someone worth remembering, someone worth being.